Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Victoria, and I'm one of the organizers of tonight's event. I'm very happy to welcome you to this panel discussion on degrowth strategies for change. This event is taking place as part of the Sustainability Week Zurich, which is a project organized by the students of all 5 higher education institutes in Zurich. All events will be taking place online, which means that you can check out their webpage to find out more information on their events wherever you are. This event has also been organized in collaboration with the Association Post-Growth Zurich, of which I'm a founding member. The aim of our association is really to spread the word about degrowth in Switzerland and beyond. And we try to achieve this by organizing panel discussions, such as the one today, and by hosting book presentations. We also try to be actively present in the media and are very proud of our monthly reading circles, which are now taking place online and which are attracting a very diverse group of people from all over the world. Lastly, we aim to spread, to increase the state of the knowledge in degrowth by conducting research ourselves. So you can find more information about our events on our Twitter and Facebook accounts. And we also invite you to sign up to our monthly newsletter to be informed about events related to our association. This was all from my side. I'm very happy to pass on to Lisa Deutsch now, who is going to moderate tonight's event. Lisa is a doctoral candidate at EAVAG and ETH Zurich in inter- and transdisciplinary science. On to you, Lisa.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the nice introduction, Victoria. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel discussion tonight on degrowth strategies. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone from wherever you join us today and whenever you will watch this video. Before diving into the topic and introducing the panelists, I would like to say a couple of words concerning their interaction with the audience. So today you will be able, and I warmly invite you to post questions on YouTube, or you can also use the Twitter and Facebook account of Post-Growth Zurich. So they prepared a post and you can just comment below your questions. These questions will then make their way to myself, and I'm happy to ask some of them for you during the last 30 minutes of the event. So now I come to today's topic, degrowth strategies for change. The term degrowth refers to different things. So it's a movement, it's a research field, it comprises different societal actors. It is a fundamental critique of the growth paradigm that characterizes our economies, but it also provides an alternative vision to our current system and outlines a transformation towards a society that lives better with less. So today I would like to discuss with our amazing panelists, who are all leading scholars in the degrowth field, how they envision such a transformation to happen, what strategies have already been developed or are currently in development, but also to take a moment and look back and reflect upon what has already been achieved. So these questions and many more I'm going to discuss with our panelists, which I would like to introduce to you now. I start with Professor Julia Steinberger. She is a professor of societal challenges of climate change at the University of Lausanne since 2020. Before that, she worked at the University of Leeds and at the Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna. In her research, she examines the connection between resource use, so energy, materials, greenhouse gas emissions, and societal performance, economic activity, and human well-being. She's also the recipient of a Leverhulme Research Leadership Award for her research project, Living Well Within Limits, investigating how universal human well-being might be achieved within planetary boundaries. Thanks for being with us today, Julia. I also want to welcome Professor Jorgus Khalis. He's a research professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, Social and Behavioral Sciences. He is an ecological economist and political ecologist working on environmental justice and limits to growth. He describes his research as undisciplinary. So he has worked on very diverse topics, from water policy in Europe or California over to participatory science, climate change, limits to growth, and conflicts over resource use. And what connects these different foci is his interest to understand why and how societies misuse their environments and why potentially useful solutions are currently not taken up. Welcome also to you, Jorgus. And a warm welcome also to Professor Barbara Moraka. She is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oregon. In her research, she focuses on environmental and social philosophy, process philosophy, and political ecology. Before that, she was a senior researcher at the Center for Advanced Studies, Post-Growth Societies at the University of Jena in Germany. Also a lecturer in moral philosophy and environmental ethics at the University of Greifswald. And she was also very strongly involved in the organizing team of the Degrowth conference in Leipzig in 2014. So she will provide us with insights today from the perspective of philosophy and ethics. Welcome also to you, Barbara. So thanks to all of you for being with us today. The title of this panel is How Do We Get Out of This Mess? Degrowth Strategies for Change. And this brings me to my first question, which I would like to discuss briefly with all of you. So what is the mess and why is degrowth the answer? Julia, I would like to start with you.
Okay, so I think we don't have the luxury of having only one mess as in the past. I think that's part of probably one of the beginning points. I think we are in an age when many different crises are coming together and are not going to be continuing together. So for instance, the coronavirus seems like an exceptional event for us, but people who study epidemics or pandemics have been warning our governments all this time to prepare for this because they knew it was coming. And we know that the way we are interacting with the environment is great for bringing more viruses into our population. So we know that this is just the first, not the only one this century. We also have a climate crisis. We also have an ecological crisis. And I know we're not supposed to answer long, so I'll just say that they're both the climate crisis and the ecological crisis are devastating, fast-moving, threatening the possibility, in my view, they threaten the possibility of human civilization within the horizon of this century. We can discuss what human civilization is or isn't, or if it's worth saving or not. But I think the people that are supported by human civilization are currently worth saving. I'd quite like to focus on that. And I think that they also have historical origins, that we're still living through the outcomes of great crimes that were committed in the past and not resolved. And these are social crimes as well as natural crimes. I'm talking about colonialism, I'm talking about racism, which was invented and amplified to give colonialism a reason to exist. And all of these things brought together an economic system that we live within today. And that's intent on extractivism from the environment and exploitation of people, and really driving these problems. Some of us have benefited from it. So there's this story around, did we really benefit from this economic system? Are the good things that we like in it really from this economic system? Or are they sort of already the existence of a possible alternative? But I think that this is, we have to understand that we're within these systemic structures of an economic system that is driving this destruction, driving inequality, and that really needs to change.
And why do you think is degrowth the answer, Julia? Could you briefly say something about this?
So I come from physics originally, and in physics we look at energy use and resource use. So my answer is going to be purely biophysical, and I'll let Barbara and Jorgus answer other perspectives. But from a purely biophysical perspective, there is no way to grow. So the problems that we have with our interaction with the environment have to do with the fact that we are encroaching on biogeochemical flows within the planet, that we are a planet, we are a force driving planetary processes, planetary cycles of nitrogen, of carbon, of in some cases water. We're really messing with the planet as a stable system. It is no longer stable because we are driving these processes. And that instability is not an end of pipe problem, it's a beginning of pipe problem. The reason that we're driving these instabilities has to do with our demand, our collective demand, very unequally distributed, for resources and energy and land. And that's a consumption problem, and we need to degrow consumption. So on average, the consumption of energy, materials, land, and various types of resources, in my view, has to degrow. There is no way for that level of resource demand to be non-damaging to our environment and to our future chances.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Julia. So what is the mess from your perspective, Jorgos, and why is degrowth the answer?
From my perspective, it's similar to Julia's, but I think I should expand a little bit on what he said. So I agree that it's what, since the 2008 crisis, we call the multi-dimensional crisis, no? That different points and moments of crisis are coming together. But to the ecological and public health crisis, I would like to add two more components. The first is the economic crisis, which is the most obvious one, and the one that in our part of the world was catalyzed in 2008, though one might argue that we are in a long period of cycles of intense economic crisis by periods of relative calm since the 1970s. And in the rest of the world, especially parts of the world, Latin America and Africa, live in a continuous state of economic crisis, structural adjustment, austerity. This economic crisis is normally portrayed as we're not having enough growth. We don't have as much growth as we would like to have in order for the economy to be stable. Instead, I would invite us to think of it as a crisis that it's the outcome of this illogical requirement for economies to keep growing at 2 or 3%, that this is a natural rate that cannot be sustained, especially for as big economies as the ones are in high-income countries. For these huge economies to keep growing 2 or 3% per year, which means they double every 24 years and they are 10 times bigger by the end of the century, is an irrational demand, but it's a demand upon which the stability of the system depends. So now we live on an extremely unstable economically and as a result socially system because of this demand for continuous growth. How this growth has been sustained since 2008 is by an incredible pouring of new money, not in the direct form of debt, but is the so-called quantitative easing, trillions of dollars or euros, if you want to say, that they have been poured. They haven't gone to the people that needed them. They haven't gone to the much needed energy transition. They just went to banks, and from banks they went to assets, and they have made also houses, food. They have made everything more expensive for the rest of us. So the way we frame that in our new book, The Case for Degrowth, is that it's almost like a god. Growth is almost like a god, what God used to be for older civilizations. But you know, at the altar of this growth, we make huge sacrifices, huge social sacrifices, if you think of all the austerity and everything that was sacrificed after 2008, but also before, in order to keep growth going, including the destruction of public health systems in countries like England, in countries like my native Greece, in Spain including, that left us naked when the epidemic came. So that's another important dimension that we have to keep in mind, the economic crisis, but to think of it in different terms. And the other important crisis is the crisis of cares. So it's the care crisis. So it's increasingly more and more functions that the welfare system was playing. Again, I speak about our part of the world. A well-running welfare system was playing is increasingly outsourced or returned, or however you might want to call it, to the family unit. And I think this became very evident with the coronavirus crisis, that families had to take over the education of their children, those who had children. They had to take care of their own selves, they had to take care of their own health, and they had to take care basically of everything, with a few exceptions. This comes on top of an intensification of this devolution of care work to families, and it comes with an already very unevenly distributed, in terms of genders, distribution of this care work between men and women. So there is a crisis of cares, and why degrowth is the answer. Sorry, because I'm going very, very long here. So degrowth is the answer in two ways. In terms of the economic crisis, is the answer because we really have to think of how to manage the economies and make them function and be stable and socially stable without growth, because that's the only way that the system can be sustainable in the future. A system that needs to expand 3% per year, it's catastrophic and it's also unstable. So that's one hand. In terms of care, I think Degrowth is really important because it calls for an inversion of priorities. So in terms of focusing on the formal economy, on the big economy, the GDP economy, it asks us to look at that really matters, and which is what sustains us, and it's the economy of reproduction and the care economy. And to really think also of how we reorganize, how we revalue, and how we support this part of the economy, which is right now it's sacrificed, and it's just the undervalued place where all the dirty tasks of the GDP growth economy that the GDP growth economy doesn't want to take care are distributed. So the degrowth is a call for an inversion of this logic.
Thanks a lot, Jorgus. Barbara, I come to you. What is the mess and why is degrowth the answer?
Well, there is not very much to be added. I could follow up on Julia and Jorgos. Let me just continue the conversation that Jorgos has started, adding one more aspect to that goes in the same direction, which is, I think that the big mess is the structural addiction of societies to growth. When I say structural addiction, what I mean is that, as Jorgos has already articulated, societies coming from the model, the one single model of development, which is based on the model of development of the UK, which is fundamentally colonial, as Julia has already said, and has to be expanded all over the world, is a model that in the long run doesn't work. But the problem is that the structure of our societies are fundamentally based on the idea of continuous economic growth, which is, as Jorgos has already articulated, a rate, right? It's not just one more unit, but it is a percentage. So it's exponential. When I give talk, usually I use this image of a hamster on a bicycle that keeps accelerating, and to represent exactly that societies are growth society. They have to keep accelerating in order to stabilize themselves. And if they stop accelerating is the metaphor for the exponential growth, they fall. And this is exactly what we have been seeing, right? If you have a growth society which is addicted structurally to economic growth, and you take growth away, the result is crisis in all possible directions that have already been articulated. And if we take this seriously, we cannot just simply leave everything as is and say growth is a problem because of the ecological crisis. Let's take it out and then we solve the problem. Because taking out growth, if the structure remains that particular structure of the bicycle, leads to not only to dramatic crisis, but also to a dramatic crisis of democracy. I'm very worried about the neo-fascisms that are arising all over the world as a reaction also to that crisis, right? So I see degrowth as an answer because it is an alternative answer to the idea of a shrinking economy, the idea of giving up on economic growth without doing anything, without changing the structures of society. Because just taking growth away again leads us into also a crisis of a political crisis and also a crisis of democracy. So what needs to be done is to change the structure of the bicycle, right? To get away from the structural addiction to economic growth. And this is a huge challenge because all the systems in societies are fundamentally linked to economic growth. I live in the US, which is even worse than in most European countries. The whole pension system depends on economic growth. Whatever you can call healthcare here depends on economic growth. So just stopping growth, as we are seeing through the pandemic, increases inequalities. Those who are more vulnerable are more exposed, and so on, right? This is why the only answer, with an incredible lack of imagination that you hear from policymakers, is, oh, we need to keep growing. We need to sacrifice everything to keeping growing because this is the magic wand that solves all the problem. It doesn't solve all the problem. It has stopped to solve the problem even for the majority of white middle class for whom it used to solve the problem in the 1950s and 60s. And it won't solve the problems in the future. So I think degrowth is the radical alternative, not just to growth, but also to models that are saying, okay, growth is no longer the answer, so let's just keep going and take growth away, which is even more dangerous. The degrowth message is to restructure societies, to make them no longer dependent in their structure on economic growth. This is an incredible challenge, and I do see that degrowers are starting liberating their imagination to start rethinking and reconceiving societies that can be freed from that addiction, from the structural addiction. I leave it there for now. Thank you.
Many thanks, Barbara. So one important step is to do a diagnosis of the current system, as you have just done. Identifying the symptoms, their roots and causes and so on, and also to outline these alternative visions for the future. The challenging question which follows then is, how do we get there? Or to say it in your words, Barbara, how can we change the structure of the bicycle actually? And for doing so, we need to take a closer look at the concept of transformation. And this concept is quite broad. So I would like to ask you, Jorgus, what dimensions or thematic key areas can be distinguished in such a transformation towards a degrowth society?
Yeah, I'm going to share some of the ideas that we articulated in our book, the case for degrowth, where it was 4 of us, and we're quite different. So it was me, myself, that as you said, I'm an ecological economist, Federico De Maria, also an ecological economist, and then Susan Paulson, who's an anthropologist, and Giacomo D'Alessia, who is more undisciplinary than I am, and he thinks, let's say, outside any discipline. So when we were together, we were thinking, okay, we want to say something about the how to, no? So we want to articulate a little bit the vision of how could things change. And the model we propose there are 2 keywords there. The one is coevolution, and the second is common sense. Coevolution is a term I've been working for years since my PhD. It comes from an ecological economist, Dick Norgard. And it's the idea that systems change together, and when they seem stuck, there is always new diversity, like it happens in nature, which creates new evolutionary possibilities that you might not be able to see the moment they're happening, the moment it's happening. But there is a change that one thing evolves with the other. Common sense is a concept we take from the work, and this is what Giacomo brought in the discussion, from the work of Italian political activist and intellectual Antonio Gramsci, who was writing in the 1930s that in every society there are common senses that they are permeating, no? And there are radical common senses. There are also, of course, conservative common senses. And the idea is like, how do you manage in the political system to see expressed, to fortify the culture of the alternative, the counter-hegemonic common senses, and to see them elevate at the level of the political of the political sphere. So the model we articulate in our book talks about transformation at 3 levels, that they co-evolve and one is feeding the other. So we talk about the personal, the communal, and the political. So the personal, we are talking about like our beliefs and our everyday way of living, not consuming less just for the sake of consuming less and reducing resource use, important as it may be, but also because we want to be the change that we want to see, right? And that's where it all starts from. It starts from the personal, of being and living different and living in a degrowth, whatever else we want to call it, way in the everyday. But if you do that just alone without any political change or without being part of a collective, this doesn't go far away. So the next level that we emphasize is the communal, is the cooperative, is you being part of the cooperations and the commons that they are taking place in your city, in your locale, in your town, you being part of your renewable energy cooperative, you being part of your food consumer cooperative. And in this way, you are becoming part of a bigger change, and at the same time, you perform and you, let's say, educate yourself and educate others around you who see how you live, that another world is possible. Again, these 2 levels alone, without political change, won't go very far away, because a conservative government or a Trump government will just crush them, you know, and they will remain like just pastime hobbies. So then the question is like how these 2 levels co-evolve and articulate at the political level. And we see a possible articulation there by the very fact that once you start organizing and living this way, you want the way you live to be protected and developed at the political level. So once everyone starts using bikes, which is a change, it's the cover of our book, but it's also a change in the common sense that took place over years, but it's a big cultural change that in European cities right now, using a bike, you're no longer a hippie, no? It's a normal way of that many people want to live. Of course, the car is still dominant, right? But car is a common sense. People organize to demand bike lanes. Then the next level is like, how do you elect mayors or how do you elect prime ministers that expand bike lanes against the motor car. That's the most difficult part, we all agree. But at least at the level of diagnosis, that's how we see the transformation happening, by coevolution of the personal, the communal, and the political.
Barbara, what dimensions do you have to add to such a transformation process?
Not necessarily adding, I also would speak of 3 dimensions which overlap to what Jorgus said, has articulated, but it's a kind of slightly different point of view from which I analyze that, but it's similar in many ways. So I would talk about the 3 dimensions of transformation, which for me are institutions, practices, and practices include both individual and collective practices, and the imaginary. I say a few words on each one and then focus on how they are interrelated. Institutions can be many things. For example, how work and labor, which is waged paid work, is organized, but how care is organized as well, how socially necessary activities are organized, how the whole debt system is organized and keeps the structure moving, how technology is coordinated and organized, how the economy is coordinated and organized, market is an institution, and so on, right? In our daily life, sometimes institutions encounter us as an absolutely unchangeable, hard thing. It seems as unchangeable as gravitation, right? I think that institutions are actually, over a long time, repeated and coagulated practices. Coagulated is a word that I borrow from blood, right? It's fluid until it coagulates, and then it becomes, something that you have a feeling that cannot flow anymore, cannot be changed anymore. But think for a minute about the healthcare welfare structure that is still widespread in most European countries and in Canada, for example, less so in the US. Who started that? It was workers who self-organized, the working class, self-organizing mutual aid. From the mutual aid, the care system basically came. The Italian word for the universal care system is still called today mutua, which is derived from mutual aid. So it's a series of practices that eventually get institutionalized. But it's not just individual practices, nothing against individual practices, but it is at the middle level of collective practices that get repeated and institutionalized. The example with a bicycle can go in the same direction, that eventually change institutions. I am more interested in looking at technologies and alternative technologies, convivial technologies, technologies that are in the hands of groups of people and are not so complex and complicated. They require hyper expert and an incredible amount of money and are totally intransparent, right? So how about technologies that are developed at the level of collective practices and eventually can get institutionalized? This is one example. The level of collective practices is also the space where we do not only think alternative, but we experience them in our bodies. And we need to make the experience how another life is possible, how what it feels like to live differently, because we're intoxicated and have been intoxicated for decades by the general and dominant narrative of neoliberalism, which is best expressed by Margaret Thatcher's famous sentence, "There is no alternative," right? And this is why I think the 3rd dimension is just as important, the dimension of the imaginary. We have been, talking about masks under COVID, we have been put in a kind of a bubble. They took away our air to breathe, because imagination for humans is like the air we breathe, is the oxygen. They just sucked out the oxygen. The Tina narrative, that there is no alternative narrative, is just taking away the air to breathe. We have to recuperate, reoccupy the space to be able to imagine radical alternatives. We're just like, what could be? There is no alternative. Yes, they have been repeating it so long that it became true. So we need to start developing bold imaginations and reappropriate imaginaries, dream utopias, not abstract utopias, concrete utopias, but they have to be linked to practices. How can we link bold imaginaries to collective practices, to group that, bring them into the ground and start embodying them and living them? And then when we feel in our bodies what it is like, that it gives us also the power to engage in political action. This all sounds utopian. You have seen that happening everywhere. And these different dimensions are all connected. You need to have a group supporting each other with reciprocal care and self-care. This is essential if you want to go for a radical transformation of society. And you need to be able to do it in a material sense, in a social sense, and in the sense of the imaginary. And you also need it because if you go for radical changes, you might have to encounter at a certain point, not only reactions, but also sometimes repression. So you have to be able to stand against that in different ways. I am always a big fan of civil disobedience and peaceful protest, but that requires networks and alliances supporting each other. So let me just conclude, going back to example of technologies that I see already embodied, for example, in the global commons movement. Convivial technologies that can be developed through networks that are global. No copyright, no private property. Cooperation is way better than competition. This is a radical challenge of the whole imaginary that we have been intoxicated with that competition is always better. This is crap. It's not. It has never been the case. So cooperation is better than competition. New technologies developed with the global sharing through a commons-like structure, but then they are implemented locally according to the needs of local communities. And they can be improved locally according to the needs of local communities. At the political and institutional level, we need institutions that enable that support that instead of suppressing it, because it goes against the TINA narrative of competition and the market and so on, right? So there are different things we can talk about, and I'm sure later we will talk more about concrete examples, but I leave it there for now. Thank you.
So for understanding the concept of transformation, Jorgus pointed out it's an interplay of the personal, the communal, and the political. And you, Barbara, pointed out it's the interdependencies of institutions, practices, and the imaginary. How do you approach transformation, Julia?
So I think a lot of things have been said already. I think one of the things that it's always hard to think about how you change the world, but honestly, the world is changing whether we want it to or not. So I think one of the things that helps to be part of transformation is the realization that maybe there is an alternative in another way. It is up to us. Like nobody else is going to do this. So I think that that's something that that I'm trying to take more to heart and communicate to as well to my students. The way we teach, for instance, can change. We can teach our students to be actors rather than recipients, you know? So basically in every way of life or in every arena in which we come to have some kind of effect, we can try to bring these ideas forward. And I think that it was very good that Jorgus and Barbara sort of outlined these multiple different ways that change can work its way through our actions and our thinking. I think for me, one of the most important areas is to change the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and about our place in the world. So one of the things we're told is that we're responsible and complicit for the problems we face. We're told that as consumers, this is our fault because we demanded climate change. We demanded exploitation and child labor. You know, every time a Swiss person buys chocolate, and boy, do they buy chocolate a lot, they demand child slavery in Ivory Coast. That is what they want because that is what they are buying with their dollars, or francs rather. But that's not true. They don't want that. They're not horrible people. They don't know. And there's a reason they don't know. So I think that one of the things to understand, in terms of changing the power of ideas and the way we understand, so there's another story to tell ourselves that's much closer to reality, and that helps degrowth come forward, and that helps the transformation we want to see. And one of them is the story that Barbara was saying, which is that we work to help each other. Like the good things in our life do not come from capitalist-led growth or whatever. They come from societies of mutual aid that were then turned into the welfare state that then keeps us from dying, or from having to take care of our old people and our children and our ill neighbors and everything. So we work for each other. Like we can use our productive capacity and our imagination for each other. And that is what keeps us going. And that is what has kept good things coming our way. And so I think that that's one of the things to understand. We can also understand well-being differently. That has to do with my research, where we're taught that well-being is living standards, is consumption, is material goods and services, like the more, the better. And that's wrong. I mean, it's wrong empirically, but it's the story we're told. So we can think about well-being differently. We can look at actually what underpins well-being, and that's social relations, that's time, that's freedom, that's a lot of intangible things that are quite good, and also give life meaning, as opposed to just consumerism, which turns out is quite bad at this. And I think that one of the things we can also understand is a battle of good and evil. And I know that maybe we'll have a debate about this, because I know that Jorgus thinks my thinking is too simple on this. But I think we are in this we can see ourselves as good, and we can see ourselves and our goodness as expressed in the actions we take to protect each other against these forces that are bearing down on us right now. So rather than rather than the story that we're told, where we are part of destruction, where our inner nature is destructive and competitive and complicit in evil, we can tell ourselves a story of goodness and resistance and protection and trying to save each other and whatever we can of the natural world. And I think that also gives people more motivation to change the world around them, that we have the possibility within us to create that, I think can be quite powerful. So how we change the way we see ourselves and our role in the world is hopefully a part of changing it.
Yeah, you all emphasize that it's important not only to talk and dream about alternative futures, but also to experience them. So are there any concrete examples of spaces where people can actually experience these kind of alternative futures, or examples of specific cities or countries, whatever, who have implemented concrete strategies who tackle these different dimensions of the transformation you have pointed out? Barbara, do you have an example?
There are so many, right? So it's hard to pull one. The one that I always have in mind, but I think Jorgus can say more about that, so I probably leave it to him. I don't know how they are doing right now, is the Cooperativa Integral Catalana, no? The Catalan Integral Cooperative, which is a great example of how to make really cooperation the core in giving people possibilities for solidarity and cooperation locally. And they started during the big crisis that hit Spain after the global financial and economic crisis years ago. So it was guided by a need for reciprocity and survival for many people, but also by a need of creating alternative ways of not just surviving, but experimenting with a life which is no longer depending on structures that are guided by debt, that are guided by the idea of accumulation of wealth and material wealth, etc. So this is the one that comes to mind. The other big, I mean, my examples are more general because there are so many within each one that you would have to open the box and look for them, is what you find in what I call the Global Commons movement. There is this one page among many, which is the peer-to-peer foundation that collects several examples of what that means. And what I like of the Global Commons movement is that it really gives us, it challenges the old narrative about how production of anything we need should be, right? We can produce anything we need in a very different way, based, as I said, on collaboration, on cooperation, on the local need in a self-determined way. Well, self-determined is not just individual selfishness, but is the community self-determining what are the needs and what is important, instead of depending on others telling them, right? Or depending on the laws of the markets, whatever they are. So, and you can go and look for so many things that are listing up there. There are examples from, especially in areas with the crisis hit the most, of young people going back to the land and bringing in innovative and local technologies and collaborating with old folks, peasants and farmers being in the land and having that level of exchange, supporting local production. But there are tons of examples like that, which arise in a time of crisis, but they can have guarantee a level of self-support in the long run. And I think I was just trying to to see whether I had a third example. Oh yes, sorry, which is more global. It's the global tapestry of alternatives. It's also something that you can go and look at. And the message is that there is no one way, but there are many ways. There is a pluriverse of alternatives that they can be very different because they have to fit the local context, the cultural, economic, social context. But they can learn from each other and be connected in a global network and support each other in the struggle and in the implementation. So these are the three things that I would recommend everyone to go and look at. There is way more, but this is what I would suggest for now.
Julia, I would like to continue with you. So you focus on how to reduce consumption and production. And you mentioned also in our pre-conversation that nobody really wants to talk about reducing consumption, and we have actually lost precious time in not talking about it. So why do people not want to talk about it, and how can we actually address these fears people seem to have? What strategies do exist for addressing this?
So I think this goes to what I was talking about just before, this idea that there's been this very strong narrative about consumption being the same as good, consumption being well-being, that the more you have, the happier you are. And I think it's also something that is an outcome of, it's sort of a natural reflex in a very insecure and, as Jorgus said, crisis-prone economic system. That one way that you protect yourself against that kind of crisis and insecurity is if you own physical assets, you are less insecure, or at least you feel less insecure than you might be otherwise. So there's that tendency as well. And presumably in a situation where people are more secure, that tendency might go away. But I think that that's consumption is the way the economy keeps going. So we are in an economy that is endemically overproducing. And because of productivity increases, and you still need to keep people employed. So rather than just, send everybody home for half the day and just live perfectly fine, there's this tendency of overproduction that then needs a counterpart of overconsumption. And there are various strategies of manufacturing around, planned obsolescence, or always forcing people to get the next thing, the next car, because your finance becomes due. The next phone, the next this, the next that. And so overconsumption is we have this basic understanding that that's what keeps our economies going. And so if you tell people, okay, we need to consume less, first of all, there's loss aversion, because they're like, oh no, what am I gonna have to give up? And there's it's like, you're gonna judge me, what am I gonna have to give up? And that's really funny, because you get that with sustainability researchers too. Like, they don't wanna talk about consumption either quite often. So it's like, oh, I'm coming for your pizza. Whatever, like, I'm coming for you. You can have fun with it, because people have this sense of Judeo-Christian guilt around consumption that is hilarious, and it makes us completely unable to talk about it in rational people. And there's this whole emotional, my entire validity is reflected in my consumption habits, and if you change that, anyway, so people get very silly about it. There's all kinds of issues there. And it's also what we understand to be the underpinning our economy. We have these sort of retail consumption, overconsumption based economies, and when you threaten that, you're threatening economic stability, which is a big problem. However, reducing consumption does not have anything to do with reducing well-being. Certainly not talking about poor people, not talking about deprivation. I mean, we definitely want to alleviate deprivation completely, but reducing overconsumption does not make people more miserable, far from that. But it has to go with an economic transformation that gives people economic security, and that also gives people the capacity to consume less and live well. And that's something really important and also understudied, is that there's a real trade-off here. It is not physically possible for somebody living in the US to consume less and be okay, given the current lack of public infrastructure that would allow them to do that. So what we need is public investment, we need jobs, we need actually the economy to be doing this very, very basic stuff that does things like housing retrofit, allows us to live, have our dwellings be efficient, and so that we can have sufficient energy use. So these kinds of things really need a lot of investment. We need investment in public transportation. We need to take the commons back in terms of the public spaces in our cities, take them back away from the car and give them back to people. So all of these things are publicly facilitated in some ways, or facilitated through the community. And that's something that that I think is not yet understood enough, how much reducing consumption is not like this personal frugality that we have to go embark upon, but it's a shared effort to allow people to live well with less. And that really needs to be what our economies are producing, is producing our capacity to live well with less.
Jorgus, is there such a thing as a best practice country or best practice government where we see these kind of measures that Julia and Barbara just outlined already implemented?
No, I'm afraid no. I don't think there is a place, but I think we also have to, I mean, we are not there yet, so it's not that these ideas have become prevalent or dominant, and then you have the first countries that are putting them in practice on a massive scale, of the political movements that have taken power in certain countries and are moving in this direction. So we are not there. So I would say the equivalent phase we are is like towards the end of feudalism, when the first traders start taking the boats from that was not the end of feudalism, a little bit before now. They start trading from Venice to other places, and they start signing contracts. So you have the first signs of a new system within the old, but you don't know where it's going, and no one can predict that it's going to substitute the old. I mean, we would like it to substitute, but it's not a given now. It's far from a given, let's be honest. But what we can say is that we do have this first, within brackets, traders equivalent within the feudalist system. So within the capitalist system, we have what feminist economists, geographers, Gibson Graham have called the community economies. So there is a wealth of community economies that once we learn to look at them and not understand the economy just as firms producing with private property for profit, and we start understanding that there are many other ways of provisioning, we look around us and they are everywhere now. There are different ways from the public systems. And of course, there are all the sort of community systems, from the non-profits to the cooperatives, to direct barter networks, to all sorts of different economies that they exist right now, and they offer the seeds of the alternative. But these are just the seeds, you know. We would be a lie to say that they are organized and systematic alternative. But I think this movement for the commons is where I see hope. And for example, here in our city of Barcelona, a movement emerging from this type of activities and equipped with people working in this type of alternatives took the power in the city and has been governing for 6 years. Hasn't changed the world and hasn't made Barcelona a degrowth city, although the right-wing critics like to call the government the degrowth government. But I don't think they've done that. And they've actually paid for their social programs through the booming real estate market here. So there are all sorts of contradictions. But there is a sketch now of a potential alternative. There is a sketch of community economies organizing also politically and taking power, and then trying to open up more space for community economies. That's one way to look at that. The other way that I like to look at that, and I looked on a recent paper, is to look at also economies that we consider as left behind or underdeveloped, and start seeing them under a new light, that perhaps they are what Serge Latouche called undeveloped. So they're not either underdeveloped or developed, economically developed within our terms. And there are places that they are in this in-between spaces, like the so-called backward spaces of Europe, etc. That, you know, full economic capitalist development has not arrived. And again, you have a proliferation of different ways of being, but different mindsets, different imaginaries, different modes also of consumption, less than the ones you find in the urban core. And they are still there. I'm thinking now of Greek islands because I recently wrote a paper with good colleagues and friends on that. But I'm sure there are other places around the world. And it's also good to look at them, especially given our predominant urban focus, where we tend to forget these rural areas. So yes, there are parts of it, and there are places through which we can begin to think about alternatives.
So Jorgus, you said we are not there yet, and some people would argue we will actually never get there because the system is so full of lock-in effects that we won't be able to break out of it. But instead of looking only at the challenges and obstacles ahead, I would like to ask you to also look into the past. And I'm wondering, what were actually major obstacles and challenges in the past? And probably they also seemed overwhelming at a certain point. And yeah, which of them could actually be overcome and how? Julia.
So I'm not sure if you're talking about social progress or environmental progress. And in some
challenges that the degrowth movement faced in the past.
The degrowth movement, I don't know if it's that old. Maybe I'm the wrong person to answer this per se. I guess one thing I could say in terms of alternative provisioning and examples of transition is that one of the things we don't see the perfect place. And I think we even wrote a blog called, at some point, in answer of one of our papers, we actually wrote something called Stop Looking for El Dorado. So there is no El Dorado. We have to create it, but there are elements of it. And so just to reinforce that, for instance, during the COVID time, my colleague Milena Bux and a whole bunch of other sort of crowdsourced academics brought together a policy tracker around policies around that became 10 ways to build back better, or 10 principles to build back better. But they were actually implemented policies that governments, whether they were city governments or national governments, had put into place to certainly move in a post-growth or well-being economics direction. And so I think that that kind of effort, it's not like one place was doing all of it, but at least one place was doing each of it. And I think that there are a lot of very, very good ideas to draw on that have been implemented in that direction. So maybe the way of thinking about it is to get these good ideas and to think of creating a Frankenstein, beautiful new economy on that basis.
Thank you. Barbara, what challenges has the degrowth movement faced in the past and was then actually able to overcome them?
Well, there are different types of challenges. Let me just focus on a couple of them. One is that it seems to be finally possible, at least in Europe, to be bold, but not only, actually globally too, to be bold about the fact that growth does not always have to be the only solution. So people start talking about that. Policymakers start listening about that, which doesn't mean that they're going to implement degrowth policies, but the big God that Jorgus was talking about earlier seems to be a smaller God right now. So it is possible to start addressing that. In particular, to start addressing GDP. We just have heard that at the UN level, GDP as measurement is questioned. I'm not sure that the alternative they're proposing is a solution, or it's just a partial solution, but at least you're not only being persecuted as a terrible, immoral atheist if you question GDP and economic growth. So this is a kind of challenge that I think we overcome. The other one is that during the pandemic, I'm very resistant to see good things because a lot of people are suffering so much. But there is one aspect that has been experimented willy-nilly, which is pockets of basic income experimented in some countries. For example, I didn't know, but Canada has been paying 2,000 Canadian dollars per month to people who have lost their job. Just like that. And some people are looking into that and doing research into that because it is a model of basic income. There are many different models of basic income. Many of them are not compatible with a degrowth perspective, especially if they are linked to a neoliberal conditioning of what people are supposed to be doing. But it's still interesting because the resistance against any thought about a basic income is kind of, falling away. Even Italy has experimented with a variation of it. So I think that's a possibility. You can start talking about that at least, and then there will still be a political discussion about where to go. The third example that I want to address is the internal challenge that is particularly dear to me. I mentioned that at the very beginning, and I think that the degrowth movement so far has successfully presented itself position itself against neo-fascist risks, or risks of interpreting degrowth in a way that could support forms of closed and racist localism. You know, there is a version of bioregionalism which is often translated into a neo-fascist narrative. It's just us versus them. Or part of that discussion is that, well, we don't have growth anymore, so we should indeed go back to care burden on the families and back to traditional patriarchal gender relationship. So there has been attempt over and over again to take degrowth and use it as a wedge to bring in those neo-fascist narratives. And I am very happy so far, but I might be wrong, so tell me whether I haven't seen anything or something, that the degrowth movement, as heterogeneous as it is, because it is not one thing, has managed to keep this out. Including a certain narrative of population control, which comes from a very right-wing perspective, right? It is embedded in the, so, and I am very happy about that. So I think we have successfully met with some of these challenges, but there is a lot to do, of course.
Looking at the clock, I would like to come to my last question. And that is, how can actually the wider public be taken on board of the degrowth journey in a democratic and deliberate way? And when you answer this question, I would also like to know what got you actually on board? What triggered you, and how can this potentially also inform a strategy to get the wider public on board? Jorgus, I would like to start with you.
It's a combination of things. I don't know if my journey is the best one because it's a little bit intellectual, and I think intellectual lives tend to be the most boring. I would be interested to hear people who have arrived to it a little bit more experientially than me. But I mean, there is always the background. So these ideas, let's say progressive ideas or ecological ideas, were part of my upbringing and my background. So one thing was that. But to be honest, you know, when I was 18 years old, I wanted to become a manager in an industry, and I was studying chemistry. So there are turns in life. So I wasn't a degrowther, so to speak. And I would put my tie and think I was cool. And my mother would say, okay, that's not what I expected, but fine, you know, like, he's my son and I will support him no matter what. So it was a reverse support, you know, it was like a progressive mother supporting a son who was turning conservative. But fortunately, it didn't last long. It lasted 2 years or something. They weren't big experiences. For me, it was more like it was a matter of intellectually, like through my work in environmental science and gradually doing more work, working a little bit. I worked a year in the European Parliament, and I saw all the pressure people receive there from the chemical lobby to just water down environmental regulations, you know. So for me, it was clear that there is a quest that if we want to live better and protect this planet and protect one another, you know, we have to put limits, and that there is a class against these limits. And this class has a economic sign, and the sign is dollars, you know. I mean, we might complicate the picture a lot with theories, social theories, case studies, like what I did with my PhD, you know, make it super complicated. But at the end of the matter, there is a very clear class, and it's the quest for profit and the quest for growth of profits and the protection of some kind of community and some kind of basic relationship with life. So I saw that intellectually. It resonated also with my experiences, like I'm old enough to see the places around me change, like places I loved. I saw them being commodified or being turned into touristic health, you know. Just for the sake of money, but again, with everyone just trying to survive. I'm not gonna blame like people, for example, in an island that would try to make a little bit more money each year, but the end result is the result of capitalism, which just turns everything like its face, you know. So so these are the personal experiences. Then of course there are all the other type of, again, intellectual experiences that they are not directly, and they're like the things we read and the way we see the world evolving and changing around us. And the final is also the experiences of people that they are close to us now. So I haven't experienced poverty myself, but I have very close to me people who have experienced poverty and have experienced marginalization. So I understand what it means. Also the crisis in Greece This was another formative experience, you know, when we saw how, for those of us in Greece, we saw how something that can be taken for granted and you can criticize it as saying it's unsustainable, when it's a moment when it's really unsustainable and it collapses, you know, and then you live through this collapse and you live through the everyday concern of this collapse. Again, fortunately, my middle class background meant I didn't experience the worst of it, but people all around you, you see them like experiencing the worst of it. Again, with survival and adaptation, and we shouldn't paint the bleak story. And that's something I wanted to say because I think it missed a little bit from the conversation. I think one mistake, and I think Julia pointed to it, is that we think a lot of how we can change the world, and we think always in terms of our agency and our transformation and an organized process. But I mean, if we are realistic, we'll see that the world has changed in history and has been transformed through disasters and through completely unforeseen events. So the biggest revolutions took place after wars, you know, the transformation from feudalism to capitalism took place under immense conflict and immense... human history is a series of disasters, I would say. It's not this arrow of progress that we are told. It's like disaster after disaster with the Second World War, and then like a continuous disaster for 2/3 of the world, and a little bit of peace and prosperity in our 1/3 of the world at the expense of the rest. But it's a series of disasters. And I think right now we are living into a small disaster, now all of us, not just the Greeks, all of us because of the pandemic, I mean. A small disaster is not the biggest of disasters. It's going to become bigger soon, I think, when the economic, when it starts being translated into economic crisis and austerity. But I think change will come through these disasters. It's not going to come only as a benign, well-organized and smooth project. So through these disasters, new things are going to come about, new ugly things and new beautiful things. So the question is like, how do we see ourselves organizing new beautiful things and new commons within these disasters that they are going to become worse and worse as the climate crisis becomes worse and as it starts uniting with the rest of the crises that now are happening.
Julia, do we need to outline the beautiful things that come out of such a transformation to get the wider public on board?
I think Jorgus is right as usual. I think that as a result of crises, things happen, but it's true that everything can be seen as various forms of struggle. Some of it is accidental, but I think that we have to be there willing to pull on the side of, you know, some version of humanity. And I'm very much in wanting to support what Barbara was talking about in terms of proposing a counter project to neo-fascism. So if we're not good with this, if we're not brave with this, if we're not brave enough to stand on the side, I mean, for me, my journey to degrowth came through data analysis because I'm a physicist and I was looking for green growth, and by golly, it was not there, and it's not there. It's not there. Okay, like there's very sort of gradual, slow, tiny decoupling. It's not gonna save us. It's not gonna be enough. So for me, it's clear that we need a break with the way our economy is currently run. And we need to make that change. It can be positive. I mean, my research topic shows like we can see in the modeling this Frankenstein. We can model the Frankenstein, but we can also see it when we do international analysis. We can see a beautiful new, it won't be, you know, Frankenstein is supposed to be ugly and scary. But actually we can see this beautiful new potential economy show up, because the underlying parts of it are already there, the technologies we need are already there. Some of the social systems in terms of social protection that we need already exist in various places. We can see that. So I think it's really about building this alternative project that is something that people wake up in the morning and feel energized to fight for, and to fight against the neo-fascist. We can only make it through crimes against other people. Like either we're in it together and we're going to work together and we're going to protect and get each other through this at allowing each other to live well at lower consumption levels, or we were going to be engulfed by this division, crisis, violence. And I think that I'm really hoping that more and more people come on board. The realistic, positive alternative is what I hope for.
Thank you. Barbara, you have the final word before I ask questions from the audience. What made you become a degrowth researcher and activist, and how can the broader public be taken on board?
Thank you. That's a responsibility. So let me just say quickly two things. My personal route was, I was doing my PhD after years in which I had left the academy and university altogether. So there was a research path, but also a very personal path. I had moved from Italy to Germany, and I was so annoyed as the dominant sustainability narrative that in Germany was all about, the German term is Suffizienz, which you can translate into English as voluntary simplicity, simple as sufficient living. It was all the narrative of frugality. I couldn't stand it anymore. It was a personal frustration. And I remember walking in a bookstore in Italy and literally stumbling over a book that was talking about degrowth. I had no idea what it was. I was back in 2006. So it was the very beginning of that story. And I started reading the Southern European degrowth narrative, which was not a narrative, a depressing narrative of giving up, renouncing, being, going smaller, but it was a narrative of liberation. Liberation from the addiction to growth is a narrative of we don't need to keep running, we don't need to keep accelerating, we don't need to keep having more. It reversed the whole story for me, it reversed the whole narrative. The DE, the negative before growth, was a DE as you have in decolonization, is a project of liberation, of getting rid of something that is oppressive. And echoing what Julia said before, turning it around, I like to talk about the right to live well with less. She thought about that. How don't we frame it around? I claim the right to live well with less, or like Ulrich Brandt says, the right not to have to live at the expenses of others. So turning it around and claiming it is a political right instead of keeping this depressing frugality narrative, I think this is so powerful, was powerful for me, because I feel and I have felt the oppressive power of neoliberal narrative, that it's not only about more materially, but also about better, always faster, give more. And is there a point where good will be good enough? That's for me is a liberating narrative. And I want just to add one point about the disaster story. And yes, there are disasters, and many people in the world are right now living the disaster. It might not be in the global north, or it might be in some places of the global north, especially looking at who is more vulnerable and exposed to the pandemic right now, right? Looking at tribes in the US, for example. So it's disaster. The indigenous scholar Kyle White, when he speaks about climate change, he calls it intensified colonialism. He's just saying, oh, we've seen that all. Former generation has seen exactly the same experience. Now you're coming back at us with climate change, which is causing the same changes in the landscape that destroys our life and our supports for life. So that is a factor of change. But in these disasters are also places in which resistance, and I don't like the word resilience, but sustaining resistance for the good takes place as well. So instead of thinking of the passage from feudalism to capitalism, I like to think of the fall of the Roman Empire, which is probably more similar to what we're going to enter into the next maybe 200 years. It took a long time. It was a kind of peaceful situation that started breaking apart, but it was an imperial model. One of the models that I found interesting is what happened there. The resistance happened in the form of the monks, which were people who basically went back to the land. Many of them had an intellectual background, not all of them. There were gender mixed community, who started going to the land and living together. Now, in that context, it was religious and spiritual and had the narrative. Today it might be different. But this is similar to what is happening right now. This is one model, right? And they rebuilt the new world from the ashes of the old. With a lot of problems attached to that. There is never just a good story, right? But that is what I think. I'm thinking, who are the monks today, right? Who are the ones who are taking pieces of the old, remixing that into new possibilities? And these were communities of reciprocal support. Again, I don't want to say we need to go back historically, but that is a model that happened in a terrible disaster for the epoch, right? So maybe that's something to think about.
So thanks a lot for this very insightful discussion. I would like to open up the discussion to our audience now. And in the meanwhile, I was provided with a couple of questions asked on the social media channels. And I would like to start with a question which goes to you, Jorgus. It's a question asked by Indrajit. Do you think that development countries need growth, example, green growth, to achieve a level until the basic needs are achieved?
I think I think Julia also can answer that, and maybe a little bit more scientifically than I do. In the sense, scientifically, I mean, in the sense of having studied the numbers a little bit more rigorously than I have. But I think the important thing is to provide for the basic needs of populations that they have needs unmet. There is a need for certain infrastructures to be developed. There is a need for certain flows of resources, of human and natural resources. And there is definitely a material and ecological footprint that will increase in this process. But I would like, if we take seriously the degrowth point, that growth is almost like a religion, and it's a religion that is serving us bad right now, to avoid talking about growth in this context. So yes, I would talk about human development. We could talk about different trajectories of betterment in these places. We can take of autochthonous or autonomous paths to betterment, that they are there, and there are people who are proposing different ideas. What I would like us to avoid is to turn it into a pure accounting of how much GDP and how much income and how much of our incomes has to reduce for the other incomes to go up, as if it's like water tubes in a, you know, like a chemical lab. I said I'm an ex-chemist and I hate chemistry. So, you know, when I think of this, when I think of the tubes and the liquids going from one tube to the other, but, you know, a lot of the discussion goes like, oh, how much has the North to degrow or the South grows? No, that's precisely the wrong type of question to ask. So yes, the South has to develop, although this word can be problematic too, but has to serve the basic needs of the people. They have to establish welfare systems that provide care and healthcare and mutual care for everyone. They have to become societies that they are much more equal. Right now, they are extremely unequal, and you have elites that they siphon all the money that they can to other parts of the world, and they live exorbitant lives. So yes, we need equality, we need the sufficient level of development, but I wouldn't put it in terms of GDP growth.
Julia, would you like to add something to this?
I can add a few things. So we actually wrote a paper where we tried to model, so it was sort of a how low can you go? So how low with existing technologies can we imagine that people could live well? So if you have the most efficient technologies, but everybody has access to them at a sufficient level, even though Barbara doesn't like the word sufficient, but this is sufficiency in terms of needs met. And there are some countries where even at that level, with the highest, most efficient technologies, and just basic needs met, are not like currently consuming that level of energy. So you know that there's pretty horrible deprivation there. I know that there's some sort of romantic idea that it's possible to live a good life, maybe without all the modern trappings. I would challenge that because I like health, and it turns out that health is associated with having things like electricity. So, you know, I don't see why I should make the decision that other people should not have the same life chances I had. But the good news is that in that achieving high health and high human needs satisfaction does not require that much, but in some cases it requires a lot more than is in some countries. But that's exactly the kind of thing we can think about. And the equality part is very important. So we just published something and just in the last couple of weeks that shows that if you have more equality, it's easier to decarbonize your system, because rich people use transport and private jets, which you can't decarbonize, and poor people are, you know, we basically have this conflict between dwelling and living in the world in a comfortable, decent way versus jetting around the world exploiting and extracting and polluting. Okay, so we need to focus on the equality, the dwelling part, and that can be decarbonized and done in a fairly land and resource efficient way as well. So yeah, the answer is yes, some things need to grow, but it's not, growth by itself does not solve anything.
Barbara, I would like to ask a question to you in name of Johanna. How do you relate degrowth perspectives to the ones from feminist and agroecological food sovereignty perspectives and movements?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Also, because we didn't have the chance to address that very much in our conversation before. So I think in general, degrowth is not, for me, degrowth is not one big design, one big blueprint. It's really more, I use the metaphor of a system of islands, right? An archipelago where there are many things that are closer together. There is some systemic there, but it is and remains heterogeneous. And I think this is important. So degrowth is a place where different movements and initiatives can meet and can take something and bring something, but I like that heterogeneity and fluidity of the movement. Within the degrowth movement, there is a group which is called FADA, Feminist Anti-Growth Alliances, that has raised from a level of frustration of the early degrowth debate, which was really not considering feminist perspectives. And it was created as a group in reaction against that, right? Against, for example, the myth of reducing work, what work were only considered as waged labor and did not consider reproductive work and care work as work. So I remember at a degrowth conference, Serge Latouche were discussing that and saying, look, in Burkina Faso, people only work, no, in the Côte d'Ivoire, sorry, in the Ivory Coast, people only work 5 hours a day. And there was Antonella Picchio, who's a feminist economist, sitting on the podium and said, the women didn't work 5 hours a day, because they have also to take care of the elders and of the children. That was many years ago, right? Since then, a lot has happened in that. And because feminists have started re-articulating the degrowth discussion and Jorgus was very clear at the beginning talking about the importance of care and rethinking care. So there is a lot of alliances that can happen between different feminisms, including also the whole LGBTQ spectrum of resistance and degrowth. But it doesn't mean that they are necessarily the same. There are ways in which they can encounter strategically. And this is the same also for agroecology. So there is this wonderful book that I really recommend reading, which is called Degrowth in Movements, where the S is in brackets. And it came from a blog that came out of the Leipzig Degrowth Conference, in which several other movements and initiatives are being asked to answer to the degrowth question and say what they thought about the degrowth movement, what were commonalities and differences. And this book collects that. And I like it because it says that degrowth is in movement and that there are movements that can encounter under the degrowth umbrella without being entirely under the umbrella, but exploring alliances and networking and possibilities. So I would recommend, Johanna, you said, to go and look FADA under degrowth.info. You can search for FADA, F-A-D-A, which is Feminist and Degrowth Alliances, to look more into that. We produced a manifesto recently, in particular, with respect to COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So there is another question by Liam, who asks, am I wrong that a core degrowth idea is that by restoring public services and expanding the commons, people can access the goods that they need to live well without needing high levels of income? Julia, would you like to say something about this?
So I think that expanding commons, I think again, there's a lot of things hiding under commons. I don't think that this is the old commons, like the old common fields or common woods or common water access. So I think we're talking much more about a new kind of commons, because we live in industrialized societies of several billion people. It's simply not possible for everybody to go back to the land. That land can't be there in that way. this is where we're at. But I think that the commons in this case are much more things like they're basically forms of economic democracy. It's bringing the productive and the productive sphere into democratic community control. And so we can think, I mean, when I think of what that signifies that energy systems, water systems, dwelling, housing, transportation, etc. These are all commons. They should be commons. We should be treating them in a common way in order for them to be used in the most effective way possible with the lowest amount of resources. And it's only when these common ways of managing resources exist that we can effectively live well with less. That would be my perspective. Yeah, I guess a lot of it for me comes down to economic democracy, because if these things are privatized, then they're basically exploited for profit and generally extremely wasteful, and the profit itself goes to make the economy worse. So maybe that would be my answer, but maybe Barbara would also like to say something more.
Barbara, would you like to add something?
I think more Jorgus, really. I'm in agreement with that. I think that the question is also to discuss about how to fund public services, right? Because if we move besides and beyond a growth-based economy, we need more redistribution, which is an entirely different taxation system. We also have to address that. And going back to taxation system like the ones we had in the 1960s in countries that were Western country, right? That were not communist countries. And that is one way. The money has to circulate differently. That's the only thing I want to add, but I don't know whether Jorgus has added.
Jorgus, you were nodding.
No, I don't want to add something. I said whoever said that put it perfectly. So, and I would say he's right.
Okay, but still I have another question. Jorgus, maybe I can start with you. It was asked by Graziano, and the question is, can we agree that the bicycle that Barbara mentioned as a metaphor is capitalism? And so changing the structure in plain English means to overcome capitalism. Small question at the end.
My head, my connections did because I got confused. So what? The bicycle is capitalism? What does this mean?
The metaphor of the bicycle, the hamster on the bicycle, the acceleration matter. Not the bicycle as a thing, but as a metaphor.
That capitalism is a bicycle, or is it the hamster bicycle?
Yeah, the hamster bicycle.
But is it basically in the end a question of overcoming capitalism?
Yeah. So the degrowth, it requires overcoming capitalism.
Okay, because I got confused because, the bicycle is the symbol of degrowth and we have it in the cover of the book. So the bicycle is capitalism completely got me upside down my head. If it's the hamster bicycle, yes, the hamster bicycle is the one we have to escape. So how do we do that? That's a complex question because it has two elements to it. It has the element of how do you organize the economy differently, but that there was always the critics of capitalism, like Marxists, who would say, yes, you can imagine whatever you want, but the question is like, how do you do that politically? And you need to have a theory of how this political change happens. So then the question is like, how do you imagine this change to take place? For example, there are very good ideas now of how we can diminish and create alternative institutions to the institutions of capitalism that make us run like hamsters. No, so we have the universal care income or universal basic income for care. We have the idea of reducing working hours. We have the idea of overhauling the taxation system. Very old idea. It's not a new idea, but like taxing carbon and resources, taxing the bads rather than taxing labor, especially not the labor of working people, working class people. So the ideas are there, and these ideas, I would say, if they were to happen, they would really, I mean, the system that would result out of them you would be forced to call it capitalism. I mean, the part of the economy that would be money running after more money would be seriously constrained, if not eradicated altogether. This doesn't mean that there wouldn't be markets, that there wouldn't be forms of private property, that it's something that worries many people, because the success of ideologues of capitalism is to really link capitalism this type of things, that they are good. You know, I like that I have my computer and I don't have to share everything with everyone. No, now if someone comes now and says, I'm going to get the computer out, I need it. Okay, it's good to have your own things at some point, and we all appreciate that. Markets are also nice. When you go Sunday to buy, or Saturday to buy in the food market, it's something nice. So you hear markets and private property, and they sound appealing, but that's not the problem. It's not the private property of that type that it's a problem, and it's not the market of that type that it's a problem. What it's problem is capitalist markets and capitalist property, which means money invested to make more money at an ever-expanding scale, and everything else having to follow the drumbeat of this money making more money. So in that way, we have institutions that can diminish this hamster of money making more money. Now, politically, how we make it is a difficult question. The old answer was the working class, which naturally will do that because that's its mission. The working class has to organize and has an important role to play, but I think that the political dynamic, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And this is, I think, what we tried to capture with a different kind of terminologies we used at the beginning with Barbara about the personal, the communal, the political, or the imaginary, the practices, and the institutions.
Can I add a word? I think that's great. I just want to add that the hamster bicycle is a metaphor for that never-ending drive to further accumulation and reinvestment. So yes, that's a model, but capitalism is also many things. So there have been different forms, and sociologists call them regimes, capitalistic regimes. So it's hard to answer whether it's degrowth and capitalism are incompatible in general, or whether the incompatibility refers to this particular formation of capitalism. This I cannot say, but what I can say is that there is a way in which you can imagine capitalism without growth, and it is bad news, because it is, again, the fallen bicycle with incredibly high inequality and military control of social unrest. So this is really a kind of horror scenario, which is not completely unlikely. So I tend to say that that is what some people call austerity neoliberalism. So I would say that degrowth is an alternative. And thank you, Jorgus, for reminding that the whole, when people say, oh, you can't attack capitalism because then they are going to take away your computer, your bicycle. They're just like, this is not what we're talking about. Let's stop doing this discussion, which is so trivialized, right? This is not what we're talking about, right? It's really about something different. But this is trivializing narrative is how the Tina story works.
Thanks, Barbara. Julia, would you like to add something to the hamster bicycle metaphor and the question whether we need to overcome capitalism as such?
Yeah, I wish it had been a different vehicle, because I quite like bicycles as they are. But in this metaphor, yes, so yes, I agree that we need to overcome capitalism, and that takes various forms, including forms that can be started under capitalism, but then, you know, be fostered as it continues out. So yes, I agree that capitalism is the problem.
Let me just add one thing. The other image that I use when I talk about degrowth is a space frame tricycle that comes from a commons developed model that can be readjusted. So it is still a bicycle, but one that in the metaphor doesn't have to keep accelerating. So I love the bicycle. This is a commons-based bicycle that can host people. You know, I don't want to give up on the bicycle, only on the hamster bicycle.
Yeah, very last question, and I would like that each of you gives a rather brief answer to it. What was one of your personal lessons learned throughout the last years when you were engaging in degrowth transformation processes? What do you want to give the audience on their way? Jorgos, I would like to start with you.
I would say to the audience, I mean, I'm not sure who is the audience because I see only you, no? I don't know if they're students who look degrowthy or they're like mainstream people who listen for the first time. But I would tell them, don't be super hard on yourself. Be demanding from yourself, but don't be too hard, and don't set the bar unrealistically high, because I think sometimes the problem is to say like, okay, in order to be able to talk about these things, you know, I have to be Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary myself. Sorry for the Christian metaphor, no, but you know what I mean, that you have to be perfect, and then unless you're perfect, or if you still fly, or if you still eat a secret burger every now and then you are condemned because you're part of the system and you cannot talk against it. So I think sometimes there is an overwhelming feeling that it's too difficult to change anything. So I better forget about this whole discourse and hope that the ones who sell the rosy story of green growth and the climate vaccine are the ones who are right, no? I would say, like, be kind of yourself. I think we have a nice joke in our book where we say that less than 4 contradictions, you are a fanatic, and more than 10 contradictions, you are a hypocrite. So, like, live with 4 to 10 contradictions, be kind to yourself, and start from at least accepting that there is another story, share it with others, and then try to do what you can do differently as much as you can, but without also giving up if you can't change one single thing. For me, that's also a personal lesson, no? Because once you get into the growth, you say, okay, I could go all the way, you know, and really live the way I think everyone lives, but then you have to give up a lot of things of the way society is structured around you. So I don't think we have to ask everyone to do the sacrifices, but we have to ask everyone to be ready together with others to share such sacrifices, which at the end may not have to be sacrifices. They can be for the better.
Thank you, Jorgus. Julia, do you would like to share a personal lesson learned?
I think for me, the personal lesson, I mean, I was very afraid to get into all this social science debate and even economics in some ways, but I think the lesson is to be brave and to not be afraid of being brave. It's a lot harder on the side when you haven't sort of dived in yet. And it's a lot easier when you start talking about it and thinking about it and expressing it. And it turns out that your arguments are not weak, and you have a lot of people to read and learn from, like Jorgus and Barbara, who are really have been writing some quite foundational stuff. So I think that there's a lot of encouragement here, and I think we have to think about what we sound like as a time capsule, looking 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I think everybody is going to have wanted to be a lot braver and a lot more extreme. You know, we're always like trying to be have this perfect bridge, be the perfect bridge to our time to take people with us. But I think that bridge needs to be built very, very fast, and we need to take people along very, very fast. So I really hope that people are brave, because there's a future calling us, and there's also a future saying, you know, well done, great. And there's also another future saying, couldn't you have done more? Couldn't you have said things more clearly and really been a lot more convincing in trying to transform this, because bad things are happening right now.
Thank you. Barbara, you have again the final word.
Oh my God, that's too much of a responsibility. I love the other 2 final words. If talking about my personality and my personal lesson learned, it was while we were preparing for the Degrowth conference in 2014 in Leipzig. It became a huge thing. And when we started preparing it, I came in with, we need to plan, we need to do this, we need to do that. And the group of people said, no, we work according to anarchist methods. We work with consensus-based decision-making. We discuss everything until we have found something that can be supported. I said, it's never going to work. We have only a year. And it did work. So I learned to let go. And I learned to trust the incredible richness of different perspectives coming together, and not to have control about one outcome that I consider to be the right outcome, but because I'm not listening to others. And that doesn't mean that we need to listen to everyone else, right? There are positions that are racist that I don't need to listen to. But this was my personal lesson learned. This is why I am focusing on the heterogeneity of the degrowth movement as a place that hosts many voices. And it is developing into something that is more sensitive, for example, to decolonial perspective right now. And I think this is so important. It is what I love of being part of this movement, is that it has been open to question itself and engage with critique and with alternatives, and remaining in this openness. I guess this is my message, which is again a message of letting go, of trust, but also of solidarity and collaboration. And the second thing that I want to say is the absolute importance of having a community of care. You can't do transformation of yourself, of your community, of the world, if you don't have a community of people caring for each other. This is where it all starts. Every radical movements have built a community of care, of mutual aid and reciprocal care. This is what makes us all strong. This is what we need to work on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. So unfortunately, we need to come to an end. Let me thank you for your time, for all the insights you provided us with today. I wish you all the best for your future research, for your future activism, but also all the best for getting through this pandemic in the next weeks and months ahead. Thanks a lot. And this also applies to the audience, of course. Thanks a lot for joining us today, and also all the best for you in the future. A very final word before I hand over to Victoria. I want to thank again the organizers and volunteers from the Sustainability Week Zurich who make these kind of events happen every year. And I also want to say thank you to the core team of Post-Growth Zurich who have organized this event. This is Victoria, Julia, Lawrence, Raphael, and Leonard, who are making a huge effort in setting up a space for discussing, reflecting, and developing degrowth ideas further here in Zurich. So thank you all. And now over to you, Victoria. The micro is yours again.
So thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks very much again to the panel speakers for such a fascinating debate. Thank you, Barbara, Julia, and Jorgus for being with us here tonight. I guess this would be the time for clapping if we were sitting in a lecture theater. But I would also like to thank Lisa for doing an excellent job at moderating tonight's event. And also thank you, Yamin, for your technical support throughout this event. I would just like to briefly share my screen with you before we come to an end and raise your awareness to these two discussions that are taking place tomorrow, always within the Swiss Sustainability Week. Both of them will be in German, and we're very pleased that there will be another panel discussion on post-growth economics. One last thing, within the YouTube comment section, you will find a link to a survey which you can use to give us feedback on this event. We're also very happy for any feedback which you can post on Twitter or Facebook. And lastly, I want to thank you all very much for being here with us tonight or today, wherever you are, and we hope to see you very soon at one of our next events.